Hey everyone, it's Apex, and on today's tier list, it will be a little similar to one of my previous ones. It will be covering all the classes and specs in arenas and PvP and Wrath, but with no PvE gear taken into account. So this is just honor gearing, just arena, and just BOEs. So maybe you're gearing up an alt and you don't want to spend a lot of time on him gearing because you don't want to raid, or maybe you just don't want to raid in general. Whatever the reason may be, this video will be for you guys, and you'll see how it changes things quite a bit. So with that, let's get into the video. Okay, so we'll be starting in reverse order this time. First with Rogue. Now, combat is weak to begin with. Without armor pen gear, it will be extremely weak, as this setup usually is 0 to 400 Resil. They want to have full PvE gear with full armor pen gems. Without their gimmick working, they will be extremely weak, as you'll just killing spree someone, they'll live through it, and then you'll die. And that's about how combat will go. Now, Sub Rogue, very gear dependent, not quite as much as combat, but still quite a bit. They would typically run 4 to 5 PvP pieces, and then anywhere from 4 to 800 Resil, so still quite low. However, the utility is very strong and they can gem ARP, so this one can work as you can kill within your Shadow Dance windows, so I will still be putting sub in viable. Now we have Assassination Rogue. Now this is the one rogue spec that does not need PvE gear. It can run full PvP gear with honor pieces and just gem attack power. It's not going to suffer too much, so this one is actually quite decent. Sub is still a better spec, however Assassination is right next to it if there is no PvE gear involved. Now we have Prot Warriors. They are severely handicapped without PvE gear. They have basically no damage. They have a lot of CC, but then they just hit like a noodle. Devastate hits for nothing without armor pen. So even with armor pen gems, this one wants to run 0 to 300 Resil. So this one's going to suffer quite a bit. It will be on the lower end of weak, but it still has a lot of control, and Warriors are still decent, but I will be putting it at the top of weak. I have Fairy Warrior. Very weak spec in general. With no PvE gear, it will be terrible. I would put it very low. Armor's Warrior, one of the best specs in the game, but with no PvE gear and being very armor pen dependent for rage generation, as well as just general pressure, Arms is going to suffer a lot. However, it's such a strong spec, I will still be putting it in great. Now we have Destrolocks, who are very powerful without gear. They only need really one to 2 rings, 1 to 2 trinkets if you're human, and that's basically your BIS setup. So all their off pieces are haste, so they can do extremely well with no PvE. Very easy to gear. Destro's very powerful. Now we have Demonology. Similar story, however, Demo is a much weaker spec. However, they don't really need much PvE gear anyway, as they're kind of just a weird tanky, like get in your face caster. Very odd, but they will be inviolable. Affliction Warlock, similar to Destro, not as powerful as Destro, but their whole purpose is to survive and then do insane damage and just win with CC. So they will do quite well without PvE gear, as all their off pieces are a haste. I have Resto Shaman. They typically don't run much PvE gear in the first place. They will just run, let's say, maybe a weapon and then 1 to 2 rings and then the bauble trinket, or if it's early Wrath, and this applies for all healers, they will want to run the crystal off of Malygos, which is a half minute, or it's just a 1 minute cooldown instead of 2 minutes from bauble, and I believe it's called like an ice crystal or something. So that's very strong, but they can still do well, like use a Battle Master or a Winter's Grass trinket if they can't get that. So Resto's quite good without PvE gear. Now Enhanced tends to run a little bit of PvE gear, but they're not dependent on armor pen, so they can get by with a lot of PvP gear. They typically run PvE neck, cape, weapons, relic, 1 to 2 rings, 1 trinket. So they do need a bit of PvE gear, but it's not horrible. They're still very good, and they tend to gem Resil anyway. So Enhanced can do quite well without PvE gear, although they would like to have it. So I'll be putting Enhanced pretty high. I have Ellie Shaman. Now, the strongest caster in the game, but they would like to run PvE belt, boots, bracers, rings, and a trinket, as their honor belt, boots, and bracers, unlike the other casters, have no haste. So they can only run crit or MP5 if they want those Resil pieces. So that's a huge problem. However, at least they get trained a lot, so they sometimes run a very high Resil build. On my Shaman, I have 2 builds. One is about 1200 Resil, and the other one's almost 1600. The highest out of probably most specs in the game, as you don't really have good defensives. So Ellie can do very well though. You can just run that high result setup and I'll be putting them very high. We have Shadow Priests. They pretty much gear the same as Destro Locks. They just want 1 to 2 PvE rings and then 1 to 2 PvE trinkets, depending on if you're human or not. So very powerful. All their off pieces are haste. So Shadow does extremely well without raiding. I have Holy Priest, quite weak in the first place. Without PvE gear, it doesn't matter a ton. They're still quite weak. I'll be putting them on the lower end of weak. I have Disc. They would like to have 1 to 2 rings, maybe a weapon, but they can usually run like the 2-handed Spirit Staff and then the other Resil one-hander and just have 1 for HPS and 1 for high mana regen. So they're fine. You know, they like to have Bauble and the other trinket. If they're human, maybe they want to have Solace too or some kind of mana regen. But very strong. They don't really need to raid either. Now you have Ret Paladins. They want to raid pretty badly. They're similar to Warriors in a way as they need to crit to get their Art of War procs, which will mean their insta-heals, their exorcisms. So probably going to hurt them a bit, but still very strong. They don't need armor pen, so that helps. But I'll be putting them on the lower end of great, but I will put them ahead of Warrior. I have Prot Paladin. They have decent damage and they have decent survival, but they don't have good healing. They're not the best in the first place. However, they can still do good damage and they don't need armor pins. So they're decent and they can certainly be viable. Holy Paladins, they'd like to have the Bauble trinket or the Malygos one like everyone else. But other than that, it's just 1 to 2 rings, maybe a weapon. They actually can run some 284 pieces as they're so tanky. They could use the 284 pieces for the higher HPS they could get. So they'd like to have the option. However, they can totally get by with just Resil off pieces with the crit or the MP5. So Holy, very powerful. Still the best healer with PvE or without with PvE gear and with just PvP gear. Now we have Frost Mage. They are very good, just like all the other casters. They only need the haste off pieces and then ideally 1 to 2 PvE trinkets and then 1 to 2 PvE rings. That's really it. They can also use like the shoulders or the pants to get the hit cap, as you could swap 1 of your crit pieces for a hit haste piece and that'll give you a better stat itemization. So Frost doesn't need to raid. It would like to, but it doesn't need it that much and they're very strong. I'll be putting them pretty much at the top of great. And then we have Fire Mage. Not as strong as Fire. It has the same gearing as Frost Mage, but it will be lower in general just because it's weaker. It can run with the Boomkin though, so that's decent. So I'll put them on more like the middle of viable. I have Arcane Mage. Similar story to Fire, but they do kind of run a more gimmicky style. They want to run some PvE pieces for the mirror image damage bonus if it's late Wrath. And I'm sure there's some other stuff in early Wrath. So they need PvE gear a little more because they're quite a bit more gimmicky. So I would probably end up putting them more of the lower end of viable or probably the top of weak. I mean, actually, a Prot Warrior is probably slightly better than Arcane. A Survival Hunter. So they'll get their black arrows dispelled. They won't do much damage. They will just be a much weaker version of the other 2 Hunter specs and then just die. If they had a lot of PvE gear, they could at least do some good damage. With black arrow getting dispelled and no PvE gear, they're going to suffer a ton. So they're going to be very weak, probably right below Arcane. Now we have Marksman Hunter. Very strong spec, but very gear dependent. They do want to have lots of PvE pieces with sometimes armor pen gemming, depending on how much you have. So they will be hurt quite a bit. They usually run 5 PvP pieces, 6 actually with trinket. So they're going to get hurt a bit, but you can still just gem armor pen and do decent, but you'll be hurt quite a bit. However, not as badly. So I would probably end up putting them probably somewhere around here. As you can see, all 3 of these are hurt quite a bit if you look at my other tier list. Now we have Beam Hunter. They have so much damage from their pet, and they can just gem for damage and play with a Shaman, so they're nowhere near as gear dependent. But they're not the strongest spec in the first place, so I would end up putting them in viable just based off of being BM. They have Resto Druids, who are not very gear dependent from PvE. They would like to have 1 or 2 rings, the Bauble trinket that all healers want, but the healer gearing story is pretty much the same across the board. Just 3 to 4-ish PvE pieces, and then just all PvP with Resil. I'm going to put them on the lower end of great. They are the worst healer of the 4, however, not by a ton. It's not like how weak Holy Pally is in BC or how weak Resto Druid was in Classic. All the healers are still good. And then we have Guardian Druid, which does not exist. This is actually going to be the 4th Paladin spec in my list, which was discovered on private servers. It's called Preg, named after the Paladin. So that spec is extremely gear dependent. Ret is quite gear dependent, but Preg is very gear dependent. It needs high crit to function. Without high crit, you won't be getting the procs, and you can't do your instant flash of lights, which is what makes it really shine. It's a lot of auto damage with a lot of globals spent on instant flash of light. Without crit, it'll be hurt massively. It's still a good spec though, so I will be putting it at the bottom of great. Now I have Feral Druids. They tend to run about 4 to 5 PvP pieces, maybe 6, so a very low resil, under 1,000 for sure, and a gem armor pin typically. So Feral is going to be hurt a lot by not having PvE gear. They're pretty much like Sub Rogue, but they're very strong. The instant clones are still good, so they can still do decent. And they're similar to Preg, so I would end up putting them actually right below Preg. Now we have Boomkins. They only really need weapon, 1 or 2 rings, and then 1 trinket. That's it. And then they just run all PvP gear. They can gem for spell power or haste if they want to do a more bursty style, but they're still pretty decent. I will be putting them, as they are a little weaker than these other specs in general, I would put them on the lower end of great, but still totally fine. You can play with a Fire Mage, you can play with like an Ellie Shaman, so very good. And we have an Unholy DK. They tend to run a bit of PvE gear, but they're not armor pen dependent. So they run 1 to 2 trinkets, 1 to 2 rings, and then typically boots, neck, cape, and sometimes they run like shoulder, and then typically PvE weapons. So they run still usually over 1,000 resil, all the way up to 1,200-ish. So they're not going to be hurt a ton. They would like to have it, but they don't need the armor pin, so they're still very strong. I'll be putting them pretty much at the top of great, as they are not that dependent on it. Their Frost DK is slightly more gear dependent, as they really need to have high burst, but they're still going to do fine because you could just gem strength. So you could just go full resil gear and then just gem full strength, as you're not missing out on that armor pin. So they're definitely decent. Not as good as Unholy though, but I'll be putting them on the lower end of great, as they can do okay. And then we have Blood DK. Pretty bad spec in PvP with no PvE gear. You're just going to be really tanky versus melee, and then you're going to get kited all day, or your teammates are going to die while you're just not doing much. So very weak spec, probably putting it down here somewhere. And that is my list, guys. So that's kind of what's changed. To sum it up, it really seems like the casters are the ones you would want to play as an alt, or if you really just don't want to raid. Casters are barely hurt by it, but armor pin users are hurt the most. So that's your warriors, your hunters, your feral druids, and then the ones that are really crit dependent, like the Preg and Ret Paladin. Thanks for watching, guys, and if you would like to hear about each class and spec more in depth, I covered that in one of my previous videos, which I will link in the description below or at the end of this video, and I'd be happy to answer any comments or questions in the comment section below, so please throw a like and subscribe if you want to see more, and I will see you guys in my next video.